It was Christmas Eve, 1944, while families across America were gathering around warm dinner tables, laughing and sharing gifts. A group of young American airmen were climbing into the freezing aluminum shells of their aircraft. They knew, as they settled into their seats, that they might never see another Christmas again. This was supposed to be a routine mission, just another day in the long, grinding war. But it turned into one of the most dangerous and harrowing flights of that entire winter. Christmas during World War II didn't stop the fighting. In fact, it often intensified it. Across the snow-covered airfields of England, the sound of roaring engines replaced Christmas carols. The air smelled of oil and exhaust, not roasting turkey and pine needles. Young men, most of them barely out of their teens, carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. They clutched faded photographs from home, reread folded letters until the creases were worn thin, and whispered quiet prayers into the freezing cockpits of their B-17s and B-24s. These weren't hardened veterans in the way we might imagine. They were boys from Ohio, Texas, California, and New York, boys who, just a year or two earlier, had been playing football, going to dances, and dreaming about the future. Now, their reality was the cold, cramped interior of a bomber, surrounded by dials, switches, and the constant threat of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They didn't know it yet, as they prepared for takeoff in the pre-dawn darkness, but this Christmas Eve mission would push them, their aircraft, and their courage to the absolute limit. Before the sun even had a chance to rise, the heavy bombers began to lift off, one by one, into the bleak winter sky. The weather was already turning against them. Heavy, low-hanging clouds swallowed the aircraft as they ascended, and the freezing winds began to buffet them relentlessly. Visibility was poor and getting worse. Inside the aircraft, the conditions were brutal. The unheated cabins were like iceboxes. The men's oxygen masks fogged up with every breath, and their hands, even inside thick gloves, quickly grew stiff and numb from the biting cold. Every sound, the drone of the engines, the crackle of the radio, the metallic groans of the airframe felt, amplified in the tense silence of Christmas morning. Their target lay deep within enemy territory, a strategic industrial site that was vital to the German war effort. Getting there was only half the battle. They had to fly through hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, a gauntlet of known flak corridors and fighter patrol zones. Every mile they flew forward was a mile they would have to fly back. And every mile forward meant their chances of returning safely grew slimmer. As the formation droned on, the men sat in their positions. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier. Gunners each focused on their specific task, a small, fragile team suspended between the dark clouds above and the frozen earth below. The festive spirit of the season felt a million miles away. About halfway through the flight, the situation went from difficult to critical. The already poor weather conditions worsened dramatically. A thick, icy fog descended, making formation flying nearly impossible. The planes, which needed to stay together for mutual protection, began to lose sight of one another. Navigation, which relied on visual landmarks and celestial readings, became a desperate exercise in guesswork. The radio signals, their lifeline to each other and to their base, weakened and became filled with static. And then, the one thing every winter flight crew dreaded began to happen. Ice. It started to form on the wings, the propellers, and the crucial flight instruments. Ice is a bomber's silent killer. It changes the aerodynamic shape of the wings, reducing lift and adding immense weight. It can choke engines and render control surfaces useless. The aircraft began to feel heavy, sluggish. Some crews, realizing the extreme danger, made the difficult decision to turn back. Others, driven by duty, pressed on, flying blind into an ever-worsening storm. Then came the moment of collective dread, a chilling realization that swept through the crews who remained. The mission might not just fail. It could end in a catastrophic loss for the entire group. Fuel calculations, made so carefully before takeoff, no longer made sense. The fight against the wind and the ice was burning fuel at an alarming rate. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The crews couldn't see the plane next to them, let alone the ground below. What had started as a bombing run on Christmas Eve had devolved into a desperate fight for survival, alone in a frozen sky. Confusion and fear spread through what was left of the formation. Pilots fought to control their ice-laden planes. Navigators struggled to find any reliable fix on their position. Over the interphone system, voices that were usually calm and steady became strained. The men faced a series of impossible choices. Do you continue toward a target you probably can't even see? Do you try to divert to an alternate airfield without knowing where you are or what the weather is like there? Or do you risk everything on a long, treacherous flight back home, with fuel gauges dropping toward empty? In these moments, leadership is everything. Not just from the squadron commanders, but within each 10-man crew. It was the calm voice of a pilot reassuring his men. It was the quick thinking of a navigator finding a brief break in the clouds to get a landmark. It was the unwavering trust between a bombardier and his pilot, between the gunners watching each other's backs. Against all odds, a fragile sense of coordination held. Radio messages, though faint, were passed along. Leaders made the hard call. The mission was scrubbed. The new objective was simply to get everyone home. What could have been a complete disaster, with dozens of planes and hundreds of men lost, slowly, painstakingly, began to turn into something else, a narrow, terrifying escape. Hours later, long after they were due back, the silence at their home base in England was finally broken by the sound of sputtering engines. Battered and bruised, the bombers began to emerge from the low, gray clouds. They didn't return in a proud, tight formation. They limped home, one by one and in small, scattered groups. Engines coughed and choked, starved of fuel. Landing gear, frozen and damaged, groaned in protest, but they came home. Ground crews watched with bated breath as each plane touched down, its crew exhausted, frostbitten, and shaken, but alive. That night, there were no big Christmas celebrations in the mess hall. There was no singing, no grand feast. There was just a profound, quiet relief. The men who had stared death in the face just hours before sat together, drinking coffee, trying to warm their frozen bodies and steady their frayed nerves. Many of them took out a pen and a piece of paper and wrote short, simple letters home. They didn't describe the ice, the fear, or the chaos. They just wrote the words their families were praying to read. I'm okay. I made it back. Merry Christmas. History tends to remember the big battles, the decisive victories, and the famous generals. But sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't about winning. They're about surviving. They're about endurance. On Christmas Eve, 1944, for those American airmen, bravery wasn't loud or glorious. It was quiet. It was cold. It was the grim determination carried on frozen wings through a dark and unforgiving sky. And that quiet courage, that commitment to bringing each other home, is a story of Christmas that we should never forget. That's why this mission, a mission that almost ended in failure, still matters so much today. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories of quiet courage from history.